Hey everybody, welcome to Law and Society. Today we're going to talk about Antifa terror and about fascism by any other name. Donald Trump is going after everybody. And here is how his fascist dragnet has grown since he issued the first executive orders to build a police state on the premise of immigration, criminal aliens, and sanctuary cities way back in April. And I started warning about that starting in April, and I haven't stopped. And this is sort of a astounding progress report of where we are today after Donald Trump has gone into Los Angeles, after ICE agents are now invading Chicago and carrying out violent raids where they are assaulting protesters. It's also happening in Portland. It's happening in Memphis. And Heather Cox Richardson writes that on September 17th, Portland officials said ICE had violated its land use agreement by holding detainees for longer than 12 hours, opening the door for the city to force ICE to move. 2 days later, the Oregonian, Oregon Live, published a video of federal agents hitting nonviolent protesters and using chemical spray on them. Portland Mayor Keith Wilson called for a full investigation. Trump said people in Portland are out of control and crazy, and vowed to stop that pretty soon. And then after the designation of Antifa and then the domestic terror memorandum, he deploys troops to Portland saying, use full force. And to that, Senator from Oregon, or Senator Wyden, says, my message to Donald Trump is this: we do not need you here. Stay the hell out of our city. Then organizer and activist in Memphis, where there are protests, peaceful protests, said that we know better than to sign off on our city becoming a blueprint for authoritarianism. And as Donald Trump goes into these areas, the issue of posse comitatus will come into view again, especially in Portland, because it's in Oregon and it's a blue state. And I don't think the governor of Oregon is going to go along with any deployment of the guard. And if Pete Hegseth ends up sending the military, that is going to be a violation of posse comitatus if they start performing law enforcement duties. So we have to keep an eye on that. And we know that these raids are coming to more cities all across all across the country, because SCOTUS has allowed, by staying the Ninth Circuit's orders saying that these raids are illegal because of there's no reasonable suspicion, and the standard for reasonable suspicion is insufficient. But then, Judge Kavanaugh comes out and pretty much says what the majority did not say, and their shadow docket stay, which is that, you can use race and ethnicity as part of reasonable suspicion, not alone, but with others. And Kavanaugh seems to agree with the fact that the 4 points that the federal government, Donald Trump's regime is using right now, which is, your skin color, the language you speak, where you gather, and where you go to work, as the premise for going after somebody who you have reasonable suspicion would be an illegal alien, as they would say, or as we would say, undocumented immigrant. By they, I mean MAGA and Donald Trump. By we, I mean the rest of the country. And this we, they gets confusing. But, the constant divisiveness that is happening with MAGA America versus the rest of America may be in many ways going to backfire on MAGA, but it hasn't yet. And that sort of is disappointing on my part. First of all, thinking that Donald Trump got 77 million votes. So, are there really that many people who believe in everything that Donald Trump does now that he is weaponizing the federal government, going after Christopher Wray, who is a Donald Trump appointee, for an allegation over how there were 274 FBI agents being in the crowd on January 6th as agitators. And then Kash Patel having to walk that back and calling it a clarification, saying that they were deployed after the riot began, and that there were observers, but their orders were never to be part of any sort of movement or rioting, or even to go into the Capitol building. So, I've posted all of these references of how this expansion of Donald Trump's police state is going haywire. And before I focus on this terror designation and then Antifa, I want to point out to you the other places where Donald Trump is pressing down. And we know that's happening to media, but now, he's going after people like Lisa Monaco, who currently works for Microsoft, who was part of the Biden administration's task force that was looking into January 6th, and starts sort of threatening Microsoft, fascist pressure on corporate America. And on that, Professor Heather Cox Richardson writes, Trump has demanded that Microsoft fire its global affairs president, Lisa Monaco, who, as Deputy Attorney General in the Biden administration, helped coordinate the response of the Department of Justice to the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol by Trump supporters. Trump posted on social media that Monaco is a menace to U.S. national security, especially given the major contracts that Microsoft has with the United States government. So, doing the same thing that Brendan Carr did with FCC, like, we can do it the easy way or we can do it the hard way, or sort of threatening Microsoft's contracts on social media and pressuring Microsoft to fire Lisa Monaco, who is now a private citizen working for one of the biggest companies in the United States and in the world. So, with that said, with that peripheral chaos that is happening, I am going to now focus on the Antifa designation talk. So thank you for being here. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you want to take a break from this and come back and read more, listen more, then please do that. I'm going to go a little long today because I'm really going to dig into this domestic terror designation by Donald Trump. And have a drink of water. So Donald tries giving domestic terrorism designation some fake teeth in his memoranda and designation. These orders bend over backwards to designate anti-fascists and any protest that is anti-fascist as domestic terrorists. It lacks self-awareness to the extent that crimes in the executive order that Donald Trump once enforced are crimes that Donald himself was indicted for by Jack Smith. And perhaps that's where the vindictive nature of the executive order comes from, or the memorandum. He wants to go after every entity and every ideology that opposes his ambitions, his fascist ambition. After all, if anti-fascists are your enemies, what does that make you? You know, Donald Trump designates an ideology a domestic terror threat and then goes after everybody his troops feel fall into that category. The slip into fascism is happening at an increasingly fast pace. And you know, my friend Melissa Jopertier on Blue Sky posted one of Christopher Webb's comments there saying, next time MAGA asks you to define a woman, ask them to define Antifa. And to that, Melissa replies, exactly. Ask them to identify the locations of Antifa super soldier training camps. Demand names of leaders and organizers who's their PR spokesperson. Ask about FBI infiltration of Antifa meetings and demand agents who'll testify under oath about what they saw and heard there. Antifa is a boogeyman. You know, what is a boogeyman? It is somebody who, you know, people use to scare children and people into doing what they want. It is this incitement of false terror, this horror happening, and when actually the truth is, this designation itself is a terror. And the memorandum itself is authoritarianism and fascism, because it is a vast expansion of federal executive power, unlike we have seen ever. This type of presidential clampdown on a civilian population, on city after city after city, based on arbitrary and capricious standards, based on vindictive standards, based on madness. And people may say, oh no, you know, this is actually Stephen Miller. Sure, it may be Stephen Miller doing it. Great, wonderful. But it's happening through Donald Trump's chair. Either there has been a coup within there and then Stephen Miller's been given the responsibility, and I don't really know or care about that. But this is on the White House website, talking about Antifa as a terrorist threat. So in this designation, so there are two documents that I'm looking closer into today, which is the designation document that Antifa be designated a terrorist threat, and then the second one is a memorandum that talks about domestic terrorism designation. So it's a broader memorandum that goes beyond just Antifa, and you see that in Donald Trump's posts when he says Antifa and other domestic terrorists. That's the catch-all there, right? So everybody is a threat. Everybody is under threat. So he's essentially threatening peaceful protest if you use the moniker of being Antifa. Next thing you know, he's going to do the same with No Kings. Next thing you know, he's going to do the same thing with any sort of diversity initiative that goes to any messaging that is against Donald Trump's regime. So here in this designation, Donald Trump's regime says, Antifa is a militarist, anarchist enterprise that explicitly calls for the overthrow of the United States government, law enforcement authorities, and our system of law. First of all, Donald Trump is the one that's overthrowing the government and law enforcement authorities by not performing his duties to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. He is weaponizing this position to declare that something that simply stands for anti-fascist is a terrorist threat to the country, when actually fascism is the terror threat. Anti-fascism is not the terror threat. So if being anti-fascist is a posture that inherently means wanting to overthrow the government, what does that make the government? It makes the government a fascist regime. Then Donald Trump's regime says it uses illegal means to organize and execute a campaign of violence and terrorism nationwide to accomplish these goals. This campaign involves coordinated efforts. There's been no evidence of this. There's been no evidence of this at all, that Antifa is an organized group. There may have been instances where people who have claimed to be Antifa have been violent, and in those instances, the laws that are already in place play an integral role in holding them accountable for disturbance of peace or assault or any other criminal conduct that they commit. And there are local, state, and federal laws that can be and are regularly implemented when that happens. He talks about Antifa being coordinated efforts when there is no evidence of the coordinated efforts. And Melissa echoed the fact that where is all of this coming from? Talks about to obstruct enforcement of federal laws through armed standoffs with law enforcement. I don't remember one incident of an armed standoff with federal forces where the organization was Antifa and it was a massive movement so as to mobilize the federal government and the federal military power on states. Violent assault and immigration and custom enforcement and other law enforcement officer. When did this happen? The opposite is happening. ICE is assaulting protesters. One ICE agent in New York had to be relieved of his duties because he wrestled and slammed a woman to the ground whose husband had just been taken into custody by ICE. So then there's routine doxing and threats against political figures and activists. This happens far more on the right than on the left. So this idea that Antifa is causing the violence, there has been research done, and I've put it in the reference box, the article from PBS, that talks about how political violence is overwhelmingly comes from the right, far right, than it does on the left. Then this designation goes into saying Antifa recruits, trains, and radicalizes young Americans to engage in this violence and suppression of political activity, when then employs elaborate means and mechanisms to shield identities of its operatives, conceal its funding sources and operations in an effort to frustrate law enforcement and recruit additional members. I mean, that's saying a lot without any evidence of any of it really happening. There's been no report of Antifa as an organized group doing that. And just to be clear, I don't get paid by anybody except for the ad dollars I might get from YouTube while I am talking on YouTube. And that amounts to pennies for every word I speak, at even less than that. Sometimes pennies for every episode I upload. So it's not really about money for me. But what this is trying to do is to quiet, as it says, individuals associated with and acting on behalf of Antifa. No, I'm not acting on behalf of Antifa, but I definitely am anti-fascist. Because that's exactly what Antifa stands for. So there are no individuals coordinating with other organizations and entities for the purpose of spreading, fomenting, and advancing political violence and suppressing lawful political speech. There has been no instances where that has happened. It hasn't come onto the news on the left or on the right. And I don't know how many organizations are going to go into reading this so deeply. I know I'm already at 20 minutes. So I thank anybody who's with me still. But I think it's important that we learn what is happening to our republic. And this slip into fascism is picking up pace. And I need to warn. I have a duty to warn. Do with that what you will. But this episode is going to go a little long. So I'll take another drink of water. Thank you for being here. If you're just arriving, I'm going through Donald Trump's executive order / memorandum on the designation of domestic terror organizations. So please like, share, and subscribe. And I am going to have a drink of water. So the Antifa designation goes on to say, this organized effort designed to achieve policy objectives by coercion and intimidation is domestic terrorism. There's no proof of organized effort by an entity of Antifa. So if you're talking about anti-fascists, though, there are peaceful protests, and those peaceful protests are not coercion. It is a constitutionally protected right that always has policy objectives, as protests always do. There's no evidence that Antifa is an organization or that they recruit or train people or radicalize them. There's also no evidence that Antifa carries out acts of political violence on a regular basis with particular policy objectives in mind, save one. If you are anti-fascist, the only policy objective is to stand up against fascism. And what does that make Donald Trump's regime if they think anti-fascists are enemies of the state? Keep thinking about that. Then Donald Trump's regime goes, I hereby designate Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. Look, even if Antifa were an organization rather than a loosely held ideology that all anti-fascists fascists agree on, presidents don't have the power to designate any domestic organization as a terrorist organization and go after their speech and expression and right to assembly and right to organize based on our Constitution, because it impinges on our First Amendment rights if these organizations were to form within the United States. When the government goes to shut it down or criminalize these words and peaceful actions, that is actually the government who is intruding into the privacy and the private free speech rights of the individual, the right to assembly of individuals, the right to peaceful protest of individuals. And when individuals gather together in one cause, and that cause is just being anti-fascist. And if that were the only cause, even still, that cause cannot be designated into a domestic terror organization because there's no organization. And only Congress has the power to tell the president how to designate a domestic terror organization. And it must be done sooner rather than later, because until Congress does something, Donald Trump's executive order is going to be enforced as law, and it's going to clash with state governments, and it's going to clash with city governments, and there are going to be protests no matter what, because Americans do not take lightly when our freedom of expression and our freedom of speech is taken away. And it's being done by the government as directly as it can be, by the federal government, in violation of the First Amendment, in violation of the Fourth, Fifth Amendment, in violation of the Eighth Amendment, in violation of the 14th Amendment, if it forces a state, or if a state goes in and violates the due process rights of individuals in that state. So in states and in cities like Memphis, where the states agreed to deploy National Guard, the city still has 14th Amendment claims that the state may not, without due process of law and without reasonable suspicion, go after immigration or go after Antifa for that matter. Because Antifa designation is invalid because there's nothing that proves that there's an organization. In order for this designation to be valid, Donald Trump would have to provide studies. That Congress would have to look at it, and the Congress would have to make any designation that they were going to make. They're talking about all executive departments and agencies involving terrorist actions to investigate terrorist actions conducted by Antifa or any person claiming to act on behalf of Antifa, or for which Antifa or any person claiming to act on behalf of Antifa provided material support. Again, Antifa literally means anti-fascist. It is not an organized entity. It is an ideology that opposes fascism. And so now I'm going to go into the memorandum that talks about countering domestic terrorism and organized political violence. And, Donald Trump issued that a few days ago, I think on the 25th or something. So if you have just arrived, I'm going through Donald Trump's domestic threat memoranda and his Antifa domestic terror designation. Please like, share, and subscribe. I'm going to have another drink of water, and I'm going to go through this memoranda with you as closely as I can. Remember, despite the statutory definition of domestic terrorism being in the books in U.S. Code, there's no federal provision expressly prohibiting domestic terrorism. While domestic terrorism is defined in federal statute, the term domestic terrorist is not used to officially label any group as it is with foreign terrorist organizations. However, federal law enforcement has referred in some instances, such as congressional testimony, to individuals as domestic terrorists and their crimes as domestic terrorism. This executive order is a policy position that pushes the government to create a designation system for domestic terrorists. While presidents are free to announce these policy positions, these executive orders don't automatically create the mechanism. It has to pass Congress and be signed by the president for this policy to become law. And short of that, U.S. law bars the government from labeling domestic political organization as terrorist entities because of, as I said, the First Amendment protections. Then there's the peaceable assembly and peaceable protest protections as well. Donald Trump, in talking about the political violence, talks about the assassination of Charlie Kirk, rightly so, and his assassinations on him and on Supreme Court Justice, attempt on Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and says that in two separate assassinations, he was targeted. He's talking about riots in Los Angeles. Riots in Los Angeles and Portland reflect more than 1,000% increase, which he's getting, I don't know where he's getting these numbers from, in attacks on U.S. immigration officers since January 1st of 2025 compared to the same period last year. Well, same period last year, the government and ICE were not going after people indiscriminately, and the government had not weaponized the federal government to go after citizens without probable cause or reasonable suspicion. And then they talk about the ICE facility attack in Dallas and talks about multiple casualties. But so far as we know right now, what we know is that it was detainees that died, not ICE people. So where is the anti-ICE animus coming from? And that is coming from the etched bullet casing. And is that enough evidence to prove Antifa involvement? And then there's idea of about $2 billion of property damage because of Antifa groups. I don't know where he's getting these numbers from, but notice that there's no mention in the victims of Paul Pelosi, Melissa Hortman, or attacks on the FBI and the CDC. It's just set up for this order to be a one-sided thing. Because what is the harm in mentioning Melissa Hortman and Paul Pelosi, if not the attack on FBI and CDC, where somebody died? Of course, if you take all of them together, this is political violence. But this order claims that this political violence is not a series of isolated incidents and does not emerge organically. Instead, it's a culmination of sophisticated, organized campaigns of targeted intimidation, radicalization, threats, and violence. Remember, and violence. Everything else under the First Amendment is covered. Organization, campaigns, targeting and intimidation is not. Radicalization, threats are not, because they rise up to the level of incitement. And there's been no sort of proof in showing that the organizing groups have any other intention other than organizing peacefully around the country. So there's a lot of projection here. Donald Trump continues his campaigns of targeted intimidation on a daily basis, as I mentioned before, while blaming that others are doing exactly that he is doing. Organized peaceful protests are constitutionally protected, again. And Donald wants to target organizations that help organize these movements, like No Kings protest. Don't be surprised if they categorize No Kings as domestic terrorists, like I said. Remember, it is Donald Trump who is working to prevent the functioning of a democratic society, not those protesting, while he doesn't do his job and keeps violating his core duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. he's unfaithfully violating them and openly strategizing how to crush dissent. Left groups, these campaigns often begin by isolating and dehumanizing specific targets to justify murder or other violent action against them. As far as I have seen in the news, left groups do not generally engage in violent action. Overwhelming political violence comes from the far right. To counter that truth, Donald Trump's regime has removed the facts and figures from the website and has removed the name of Paul Pelosi and Melissa Hortman, along with the names of Charlie Kirk and himself and Justice Kavanaugh. And these the claims of organization, the repeated claims of organization is unproven. But judges and politicians on the left are constantly threatened and doxxed by MAGA and far-right extremists. But you don't hear Donald Trump complaining about that at all. There's no evidence that the ICE is being doxxed, but there's plenty of evidence and sources that I provided in the references that shows that judges have been doxxed after Donald Trump has targeted them. This memorandum then goes on to say there are common recurrent motivations and indicia uniting this pattern of violent and terrorist activities under the umbrella of self-described anti-fascism. And he quotes that. And, he's building this false narrative, and now he's just saying, plain outright, anti-fascism is the enemy. If anti-fascism is the enemy, what does that make him? These movements portray foundational American principles as fascist, like law enforcement and border control. But no, that's not what we are protesting. We are protesting federal encroachment of law enforcement and border patrol on American cities and American citizens. By the way, one of the people in California who was an American citizen and who was assaulted by federal agents has sued one of the people who were assaulted in the car wash, and I commend them for suing ICE. And this memorandum is twisting the narrative. Anti-fascists are against state intrusion into people's lives. Overwhelming majority of those who identify as anti-fascists are not violent. Anti-fascist is, as the name says, a collective opposition of Donald Trump's fascist state. And here we have the state accusing anti-fascist people of doing what Donald's fascist state is doing. ICE is assaulting citizens all over the country. ICE is violating constitutional protections, and courts have sided with states and individuals who have been harmed by federal ICE DHS abuse. Courts have found that Donald's regime has violated constitutional rights and liberties. So then it goes on to say, common threads animating this violent conduct of anti-fascism include anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity. Support for the overthrow of the United States government, extremism on migration, race and gender, and hostility towards who hold traditional American views on family, religion, and morality. That is a broad arch, so makes it a race and culture war that he's waging, because this memorandum is about designating domestic terror organizations. and you're going to go after race, gender, migration as premises for your designation of organizations that advocate for migrant rights and equality of race and gender disparity in this country? Come on. So this, there's nothing more American than peaceful protest. We have the right to be anti-capitalist. If we want. We have the right to be anti-Christian if we want. All this because there's such a thing as the First Amendment that protects us from governmental intrusion into our speech or religious beliefs. Nobody wants to overthrow the government like Donald Trump did on January 6th. We're never going to forget that, and we're never going to want that. That's Donald Trump's intention, not the rest of ours. Reason it is an ideological fascist regime is because they consider people's race and gender to be extremism. There's no hostility from race, gender extremists towards tradition, family, religion, or morality. The fact that this memorandum uses these markers actually proves that they are drafting this fascist memorandum with those attributes in consideration. This threatens every racial, sexual minority who adheres to the ideology that America is not a fascist state. Then talks about Charlie Kirk's alleged assassin engraved bullets used in the murder with so-called anti-fascist rhetoric. Remember, facts in this case have not yet been confirmed, but Donald's regime is weaponizing the tragedy, filling information gaps with their speculative propaganda to build a movement to crush dissent against Donald's regime. It is dangerous and irresponsible to propagandize this tragedy. One person killed Charlie Kirk, and that person's name is allegedly Tyler Robinson. And we say allegedly because he hasn't had his day in court and been convicted of the crime. That's all we know so far. It's highly irregular and even callous for the White House to make this part of their propaganda. Then it goes on to say the United States requires a national strategy to investigate and disrupt networks, entities, and organizations that foment political violence so that law enforcement can intervene in criminal conspiracies before they result in violent political acts. Remember, executive orders and memoranda are not law. They are policy positions of the current regime, and they are subject to judicial review, and there's no obligation on the part of the states to follow the orders or cooperate with the memo because it has no legal weight. The strategy they're talking about has to be congressionally created and then signed by POTUS, and then it becomes law as everybody must conform to. Then the memo says, through this comprehensive strategy, law enforcement will disband, uproot networks, entities, and so you have some Stephen Miller language going on here. All things that Donald Trump's regime is trying to do every time the regime goes after media or his political opponents or lawyers and judges or somebody in the public he doesn't like, and talking about promoting organized violence is never complete without reminding people of the organized violence of January 6th, where 140 police officers were injured, 5 died as a result, some Trump supporter died. Donald was actually indicted for conspiracy to deprive us of rights, and January 6th is the purest example of disrupting the functioning of democratic society, more so than any left or anti-fascist group. It is important to note that as it stands now, there's no law on the books that clarifies a designation process for domestic terrorism, and executive orders are not law, even when they designate an ideology to be a domestic terror threat. Obstruction of justice is already a crime. It does not need further invocation. If feds determine that protesters are obstructing justice, they can charge the protesters with that law. But this executive order is not the reason why. It is because of the obstruction of justice statute. And then there are these joint task force that he is deploying to investigate federal crimes relating to acts of recruiting or radicalizing persons, political violence, terrorism, or conspiracy against rights. Anybody who recruits or provokes political violence and terrorism should be charged with crimes under existing statutes that forbid conspiracies against the government. And ironically, Donald Trump was actually one who was indicted for conspiracy against the United States and conspiracy to deprive us of our right to vote by Jack Smith. And then he won and the case was dismissed. Any violence perpetrated by either side of the debate must be held accountable equally. But that is never going to happen. You know why? Because Donald Trump pardoned over 1,500 insurrectionists who were engaged in violent deprivation of citizens' rights on January 6th. So it's patently hypocritical and logically flawed for Donald's regime to turn around and use that false pretext to go after his enemies. Then go after the funders who are responsible, non-governmental organizations, American citizens living abroad. So targeting these people, and there's entities that engage in activities that support or encourage domestic terrorism. Of course, if there's such an entity, and if they're breaking any law that this memoranda invokes, by the way, and therefore, it's saying that there are these laws that you can follow. Yeah, there are these laws, so why are you writing this memoranda demonizing anybody who speaks up against you? All political violence must be prosecuted under existing laws. This executive order has no legal authority other than to re-emphasize that the policy of American law enforcement has to upholding and enforcing the rule of law. This executive order makes anti-fascist people the enemy, although it covers only thinly in the veil of political violence. Make no mistake, Donald wants to target people who are against his regime, not those who are for it, because in a normal world, the actions this executive order forbids would be enforced whether this executive order was issued or not. Speaking of the violent action, issuing it only exposes the regime's priorities as a Christian nationalist cause that wants to uproot secular democracy as we know it. Talking about financial disruption in funding these organizations. Domestic terrorism is something as simple as any crime committed that violates our laws. And if that happens, then it must be attended to. Violence must always be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, not just not because of the designation of anti-fascist, but for everybody, because that's what anti-fascists want as well. I want to say again that they invoke all of these statutes that Donald Trump in the memorandum says that the government can use, and two of them, 18 U.S.C. 241 and 18 U.S.C. 371, were actually sections that Donald Trump was indicted for. The section pretty much points out all the laws that federal government can use to go against political violence. And they are valid and they're true. But they first have to find the conspiracy. And then they've found there's no evidence provided that there's an Antifa conspiracy going on. So Investigations ordered by this executive order, absent probable cause or reasonable suspicion of any crime being committed, are invalid because this is a policy directive and not breaking any law that is already part of the system. Designating whole areas as priority areas for domestic terrorism means Donald will arbitrarily target sanctuary jurisdictions, as we have seen with Portland, for domestic terrorism, and arbitrarily and capriciously target sanctuary jurisdictions and states that don't comply with this executive order. He will double his efforts in these areas and draw national attention based on this false narrative that Antifa and other organized groups under the umbrella of anti-fascists are provoking political violence and therefore are domestic terrorists, when there's really no proof of that. So, White House is now the epicenter of American propaganda. Talking about the ICE, there was another article that was posted on the White House website, I provided the link, that talks about the Dallas, Texas attack. There's news that detainees were killed, okay, and not ICE agents. And it talks about the ammo saying anti-ICE. So having a bullet with anti-ICE written on it, does that, especially when the people killed are the detainees, what does that mean? Does it mean that bullet is for somebody who is anti-ICE, who may be some of the detainees? Or does it mean the shooter himself is anti-ICE, which would make less sense because he shot detainees? We don't know. The case hasn't been discussed and the facts have not been made public. But we do know that no ICE people were killed because the other, Donald Trump's regime will talk about that for sure if that happens. I'll end with this. A Harvard Law Review article concludes on the matter and says on the matter of domestic terrorism that Congress should, number one, amend the current regime not to expand executive power, but instead to clarify and clearly authorize it in domestic terrorism context. And two, require a finding of terroristic intent. With that said, I want to say please stay informed, remain vigilant, help each other out. If you witness protests and ICE assaulting protesters, record everything. Apply to be a legal observer, and I've provided the link of the references with the National Lawyers Guild. If you are protesting and not part of the legal protests who have to remain neutral, go with friends if possible. Have your phones charged and record everything. Take drinking water and also extra water in case ICE discharges tear gas or fires pepper spray. Yes, that is happening on American streets. As a general rule, find common ground between neighbors and communities. Push back against Donald's attempt to divide us. Always remain peaceful. Be joyful. Be creative. Be loud. But remain peaceful. Do not give Donald's regime the pretext they need to ramp up his police state. Be massive in your peaceful protests. Your peace makes their violence and oppression more obvious to others. We are all Americans and we all have the same rights as others. We have more in common than what may divide us. And it is time to unite. With that said, thank you for listening. Please stay engaged and stay safe. Remember to like, share, and subscribe as well.